Hello, everybody. How are you? I know that posting that ad at the beginning might have confused some people. Barry Wall, who's our guest today, asked me to please put that ad in. And I wanted to give it a lot of exposure before we started chatting because I didn't want to break up the flow of the conversation by including an ad and having the people who download the podcast on the streaming services say, huh, what ad? What is she talking about? So, anyway, you all got a chance to see the ad. Barry is here. I am going to bring him in. The reason that Negs and I are not on camera today is because Negs bought a fancy new panel for us to be able to stream together and have a guest on. And we're still trying to get the hang of it. And what we're going to have to do is do some trial runs with it. It's a question of connectivity. It's a whole thing. You don't want to know how the sausage is made. But the point is that we are going to be off camera on this podcast until we figure out how to use that panel and incorporate guests. Now, let me bring in my love. Hello, Negs. How are you?
Good morning, afternoon.
Hello, hello. So, Negs and I are broadcasting from two separate rooms today. And with that said, here is EDI Jester, the amazing Barry Wall. Barry, how are you?
Hello, hello, hello. And I believe it's about lunchtime there in America. Am I correct?
It is. It certainly is.
Hello, all.
Well, it's good to finally meet you. I've been watching a lot of your content over the last couple of days.
Well, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. I hope you found it enjoyable.
I did. I'm pretty picky, so.
Good, good. That's what we like, a fussy, discerning person.
Correct. All right, now, Barry, before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and why it is that you took such a keen interest in the subjects that we're going to be discussing today?
Okay, I'm more than happy to do so. I've been involved in equality, diversity, and inclusion since before equality, diversity, and inclusion was even a thing. So it's going on 30 years now, right back to the extent where it was okay for an employer to ask a woman if she was going to get pregnant and then not employ her. So we are going back many years, particularly in terms of the English history of this rather than the American history. And I've also been an educator. I'm a qualified teacher, and so I'm very interested in the educational sector. And I went to work at some universities a few years back doing equality, diversity, and inclusion with high-end engineers doing PhDs. And it was then that I noticed that something was going terribly amiss. And that's what sort of brought me to this most peculiar of cultural circumstances, where we seem to be arguing over reality itself. And that's what really brought me to the battle, was the search for truth and the search for clarity amidst this absolute maelstrom of nonsense, which has taken the Western world by storm. That's what brought me here. I'm by nature curmudgeonly, so I'm a bit of a bookender, and by that I mean I hold the line. I take a stance, and that's the line that I take. And the line that I take is that all of this nonsense, whichever part of it is, gender ideology, queer theory, or whatever, must end. It has no place in a right-thinking society, because it is the antithesis of the Enlightenment, which means that three of us can be sat here now having this conversation.
Well, here's the thing, Barry. Now, I went to college in the 1980s, and by the 1980s, critical theory had already infected English departments all over the Western world. And so I spent the time that I thought I was going to be spending reading the canon and studying Shakespeare, because I went to college because I wanted to become a Shakespeare professor at the university level. And instead, I was being fed Harold Bloom and Lacan and Derrida and the Frankfurt School and all these philosophers who wrote in this incomprehensible prose that then I was expected to write in the same style. And, you know, when I graduated from college, I felt completely cheated and ripped off, but I thought, well, thank God at least these ideas or this nonsense has not made its way into the real world. And it's sort of isolated in colleges where we can then, you know, turn our backs on it and forget it. So what has happened is that a lot of those philosophies have merged together and they have formed a school of thought called critical social justice. So if you wouldn't mind explaining what that term means, that would be great.
Well, what you're seeing is the confluence of what's called the long march through the institutions, which, as you rightly have pointed out, began a long time ago, probably in the 70s, would be the sort of beginnings of it in truth. And it's not unusual for me to hear that you say that the English departments were captured when you got there in the 80s. The media departments certainly were when I went in the 90s. And what we're seeing is this process of applying an almost Marxian structure, a skeletal structure that resembles the idea of the class, power, and oppression narrative of Marx,
Right.
but replacing the idea of class with whatever it be, sex, gender, sexuality, and race. This first occurred when women's studies fell to gender studies. So the first victims of this were women. Women's studies, which was then quite nascent because women had only just joined the workplace, and understanding about the world from a woman's perspective was something that wasn't always considered. We're going back, a long time now, to the 1960s. And then at that point, gender studies became a thing, and it actually took over women's studies, and it became about subversion based on this Marxist skeleton, which is why you hear people talk about it being neo-Marxist. It's nothing like real Marxism, which was interested in class analysis, but it certainly bears the hallmarks of looking the same. It's just rotten, frankly. Now, you then get to the 1980s, and Judith Butler and Gail Rubin and Pat Khalifa get together and decide that Foucault and Derrida and Lacan were rather a good idea, and they begin producing exactly what you've discussed, which is the most impenetrable garbage.
Right.
And it's rubbish of the first order. And that was designed to obfuscate reality, because that is what queer theory does. So queer theory appeared post the idea of gender ideology, which of course is rooted in the works of Harry Benjamin, John Money, and before them, Kinsey. Money was a fan of Kinsey. These ideas of sex as a spectrum, Money, as you know, caused, I think, caused directly the deaths of 2 people by suicide, which were the Reimer twins, in his experimentations, which also involved various sexual activities. So it was something that's been a long time coming. But if somebody had to say to me, well, what do you think was the key moment that set it off here in the UK, and I think possibly supercharged it in America and the rest of the West, it would have to be the Black Lives Matters incident with George Floyd.
How
And
so?
I think
What's the connection?
Well, the connection there is power and oppression. That's what the common connection is between all of them. So if you think about gender identity ideology, it's about one group that is very hard done by, i.e. men who want to think they're women, is being abused and oppressed by everybody else. When it comes to queer theory, it's everything about normal life is oppressive. Therefore, we have to bring down what they call heteronormativity, 2.2 kids and all that sort of thing. And then when you get to the other side, which is BLM, it's critical race theory, which is the idea that there is no such thing as being a sort of colorblind, that anti-racism must be your standard position, and that race is always in every conversation, including this one. So
Right.
it's a triptych of terror, and I call it the 3 udders of the postmodern, the 3 teats, like a cow. So you've got the 3 teats of the postmodern udder. Critical race theory, queer theory, and gender ideology, and they're all sucking off each one. It's, so there's this madness going on. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, it's a victimhood movement, full stop. It's about finding victimhood and finding an oppressor. And they're incredibly dangerous. There's a guy called Sam Vakin, I think his name is, who's done some work on this. And he says
He's fantastic, by the way. I've done videos on him or streams about him, and I highly, highly recommend his videos. He's an Israeli psychologist who has studied narcissistic movements and the dangers within.
He's amazing, right? And so his victimhood movements, he said the Nazis were a victimhood movement, Pol Pot, Mao. So what we're seeing is, you mentioned, I think the other day when I was watching, you talked about horseshoe theory.
Right.
Which is this idea that once you take the extremities, they get so far around the other side that they become merged as one.
Right.
Which I think, when you think about Orwell's Animal Farm, and at the end when he says he looked from pig to man and man to pig, and sooner or later you couldn't tell the difference. Mm-hmm. That's what Orwell was talking about, this sort of confluence of events that bring them together. But if that's true about horseshoe theory, then the exact opposite is classical liberalism.
Right.
the centrist classical liberalism, which is a very British sort of way of being. British are generally centrists. You know, it's do what you want, but don't frighten the horses. That's how
Right.
the Brits tend to be. So I think there's something that's interesting about that. But horseshoe theory itself, the left came up with their own version and they called it fishhook theory, which if you have a look, it's absolutely hilarious.
God.
Because what they did essentially is to do a model that looks like a fishhook. Then no matter what you do, the left's never to blame. It's always the right.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So
It's funny because remember back, I don't know if this happened in the UK, but it certainly happened in the United States. Starting in the 90s, where we saw references being made by right-wing politicians and right-wing activists to cultural Marxism. And there was a lot of indignant pushback on the idea that cultural Marxism even existed. But it does exist. Now, I would argue that at the time, we didn't see the signs of it because basically to these right-wing activists and politicians, anything that was to the left of their extreme right-wing position was Marxism. So everybody kind of sloughed it off as being not a serious accusation. However, exactly what you said is true. If you take a look at the bare bones structure of critical race theory, gender theory, queer theory, all of these so-called theories, what you see when you strip it down to its essence is a rewritten and rethought out Marxism. It's the Marxist template. And I do not say that as a criticism. I will admit that I still consider myself to be something of a Marxist. All these years after graduating from school, I love Marx's overview on the socioeconomic structure and politics and how they all intertwine. That does not mean that I am a communist. It means that I appreciate Marx's worldview. But what these other schools have done by substituting for the proletariat, let's say, you substitute people of color, you substitute gays, you substitute women, you end up with this miserable hodgepodge of victimhood that has now overtaken the discourse, and it is really, really worrying because we see the extent to which these alleged victims are willing to go to seize power. And that's something that Sam Vaknin discusses as well.
You make a very interesting point, and I think that brings us nicely to what happened with the death of George Floyd. And from a British point of view, I was asked at the time by a professor if I could look into a phenomenon that was called #ShutDownSTEM, which you may or may not have heard of. And this was a situation whereby they were asking students to shut down STEM for the day and go and learn about whatever it was they were supposed to learn about critical race theory.
And for those of you who don't know, what STEM is basically the study of the sciences, so engineering, science, and that technical studies.
Science, technology, engineering, and maths. That's the big four. And so this was the students were saying, "I'm not coming. I'm shutting down STEM." You know, that's what they were doing, and they asked me to look into it, and I did, and told the students not to do anything for a couple of hours while I did. It didn't take me that long to find out that it was a hoax from 4chan that was then retweeted by two queer journalists from New York, and finally retweeted by Ben Shapiro. And this had managed to disrupt the STEM disciplines in universities across the world. There's 30,000 scientists signed up. This is the kind of rank stupidity that has come from this. Well, once organizations who look at things with a queer and trans lens, which BLM certainly does, once organizations do that and they see that kind of weakness, they do nothing but exploit it, which is exactly what's happened. A kind of gullibility, an almost religious gullibility in populations to accept what they're told and to live by these strange tenets and mantras that have now worked themselves into most institutions and managed to do so with impunity. The only kind of pushback that was coming was from the likes of Jordan Peterson, who was talking about this long before Black Lives Matters happened. But in terms of giving it nitro, you know, really fueling the old beastie, I think BLM was responsible for that. In terms of how it's moved out, it's when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. It's really obvious. They took over the teacher training. So what we're seeing is the generations of teachers that have come from the kind of education that you received when you were at university in America. They are now occupying teaching positions, or if not that, they certainly aren't much good for anything else other than indoctrination. They will be, you know, they'll be in HR, human resources, or they'll be in administrative positions across organizations. And now they're flexing their muscles and doing so on the basis that the people above them just want to be seen to be kind and be nice. And it's this kind of sickening, sort of everything's going to be fluffy and woolly liberal nonsense. So it's a corruption of the idea of liberal. It's a kind of neoliberalism meets cultural Marxism meets everybody needs to be wrapped in cotton wool. That's where we're at.
Right.
So
Now,
it's about weakness.
It is. It is. Now, let me ask you this. As far as critical race theory is concerned, you've probably been following along with the non-traversy of critical race theory in this country, and I call it a non-traversy for the following reason, because the people who are in favor of teaching it and the people who are opposed to it, I get the distinct impression that both sides really don't have any idea what the fuck it is that they either oppose or they support. So why don't you give us a little bit of an explanation of what it is that critical race theory actually proposes?
Well, critical race theory, I mean, I think what we have to be aware of here is, and I will sort of flag up a quote by Kierkegaard before we start, which is that all the best ideas come from the minority, and before they get to the majority, they turn into absolute nonsense once the majority grasps them. And the same could be said of all this. Critical race theory in its infancy was a legal issue. It was to do with protecting people who found themselves with multiple intersections of oppression and of being mistreated by the courts in America. And it was a real thing. That people were, if they were of a particular color, going to be mistreated by the systemic problems that were inherent in the American law system. Mm-hmm. But it escaped the bounds of that, and suddenly it becomes about everyone. Well, it doesn't work once it escapes the bounds of that, because the American court system is set up for a particular reason, crime and punishment.
Right.
So once it escaped from that, it became nonsense. Now it doesn't mean a thing. They'll say, oh, well, BAME, and I'll go, yeah, who? And they'll go, well, that person. I go, yeah, but what about that person? Well, he's a bit too light. It's just insane. So it's become a nonsense. Say, like queer theory. Queer theory is fun. If you want to queer Finding Nemo, right? Or you want to queer the Terminator, or if you want to look and see what you can do with a storyline that's sort of, well, seeing that through a queer lens. It can be fun to do over dinner. It's like a dinner party trick. You do it over after you've had too much bloody wine and you've opened the last bottle of port and the Stilton's particularly right, and then you start. When you look at The Godfather through a queer lens. So that was quite fun. But these things escape the confines of academia, who seem to have been able to do this and get away with it scot-free. And once that occurs, you get multiple levels of what I would call mimetic drift. Uh-huh. Right? So Richard Dawkins came up with the idea of memes many years ago, and nobody quite knew what to do with it. I think we've discovered what we're going to do with it. So you have this situation whereby there's a kind of cultural Chinese whispers, which is what they used to call it years ago. The idea was you at one end of the trenches in the war, the guy would turn to the guy and say, send a message down the trench, send reinforcements, I'm going to advance. And then the guy would go to the next guy, send the message, send reinforcement. And this would go on down to 50, 60 men till it got to the end. And they said to the guy at the end, what was the message? And he'd say, send reinforcements, I'm going to a dance. So this idea of what was originally the factors that were meant to be holding it together, once they become part of the bigger milieu of discussion and ideas, turn into absolute nonsense. And at that point, if possible, will be grasped by authoritarians and totalitarians. You've only got to look at the work of some of these people involved to see that the base of this, the root of this, is the most disgusting totalitarianism. You will comply or else.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I remember the hilarious and ludicrous spectacle when Barack Obama was running for president in the first go-around, so in 2008 it would have been, that he was running into opposition from some of the old bulls who came up through the 1960s civil rights movement. So people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, especially Jesse Jackson, were questioning Obama's authenticity as an actual black man.
Yeah.
When running, because the argument was that Obama couldn't be authentic because he was not the descendant of slaves, but Obama was the direct descendant of an African man, which was not considered to be quote unquote black enough. And then you have to question, well, what does black mean? then black takes on a whole new meaning, which is, well, then you have to be descended from a certain line. It's almost like a royalist kind of thing at this point.
Mm,
But
mm.
really, what that was about, it wasn't about race, it wasn't about skin color, it wasn't about colorism. What it was about was that the old bulls who had been holding the reins of the civil rights movement for years and making a lot of money off of the grifts that they were running, all of a sudden were faced with young black politicians like Barack Obama and Cory Booker, whom they did not see as being sufficiently, they didn't pass muster because they hadn't kissed the ring enough, you know. And so that's what it was. It was a generational split between the old guard and the new guard. But it was couched in racial terms because it was a dog whistle message that was being sent out that, well, he's not quite one of us, is he? You know?
I don't. I mean, I don't think this type of behaviour is rare when you see people playing identity politics. Identity politics is fatal, and I think America plays a particular brand of identity politics that can be very dangerous. Full stop. The Britons aren't used to identity politics to the level that the Americans are. So we see
Correct.
it's very different over here to see people trying to play identity politics. And I'm not sure why that difference exists, although it may be geographical, it may be size. The sheer numbers may have something to do with it, but also it may be about age, the age of the countries. And that there's
Right.
there's going to be different formations because of that. So I think you can see that, but it's the same situation there is very interesting because we always had a bit of a kerfuffle over here when they made gay sex legal in the 1960s. In that Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s had to deal with the infiltration of the gay movement by the paedophile information exchange, and in order to deal with it and keep them away from the kids, she looked into law a piece of legislation called Section 28.
Right.
And Section 28 stopped the teaching in councils and in schools of homophobia as a pretend family relationships. The most interesting thing being the law was never used. Now, Thatcher at that time, and when you consider that was in the middle of the AIDS crisis, if she'd said, right, we're going to put them back in the closet, she'd have had the backing of the public. That's the extraordinary thing. But she didn't, and she was able to do something to appease the old guard.
Right.
So there's that's another, it's not the same, obviously, but there's another example of a generational handover of the reins, so to speak. But the inclusion of this idea of he's not quite black enough, I'd be skeptical, and I would want to know a bit more detail about what they said, because I think that sounds to me like the old guard saying, actually, let's do critical race theory, and I don't think they would have. I think I'm excuse me for being skeptical. I think the media is inherently left wing. And I think that the likelihood would have been that reporting may have been from a left-wing front. I don't know the exact history of it, though it's fascinating.
No, it
But it's the
actually,
idea.
I have to tell you, it actually ran on Fox because Fox was so tickled by this.
Oh, I imagine they were. I mean, it's the kind of thing that tickles you. But it's such a ridiculous question to ask. And Douglas Murray, who I know has done his stint in America, says that when it comes to all this, it feels like the train sort of drew up to the station and everybody was about to disembark, and suddenly it took off again and went in completely the wrong direction.
Right.
Well, it does. I think it feels like that to a very great degree, in that we've now got a situation whereby everything's become about power and oppression, even if you're a child.
Right.
And what you said earlier on about the teaching of critical race theory in America and the people who think it shouldn't be taught, this isn't a question of teaching it. They're practicing it. And that's different. They're not teaching it, they're practicing it. Now, if I want to teach somebody on my course, say you come on, I want to teach about something, I might give you 2 or 3 ideas around the topic that are different. Not my ideas, but ideas around the topic that are different. Or I might just tell you the story and go, make of that what you will. That's not what's happening. They're not just teaching it, they're practicing it. And I see the whole thing has got a huge kind of religiosity to it.
I'm glad that you mentioned religiosity because I actually wanted to ask you something about that very thing. So, you had made a claim in the excellent podcast that is hosted by my friends Clive Simpson and Dennis Kavanaugh. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's called Queen's Speech. It's on my friend Clive's YouTube channel, and it's Clive Simpson is the name of the YouTube channel. And you had talked, Barry, about the interest that Black Lives Matter had a policy position of breaking down the family, which is something that we also find in queer theory. Now, I did not believe you, so I decided that I was going to go look it up, and I'll be goddamned if you were not right. Now, so here's the thing. This is something, and I was telling Negs this the other day. This is something that you find very often in cults. A cult like Synanon, for example, and other cults where the aim is to focus the attention of the adults completely on the needs of the cult and the cult leader. And so, therefore, it becomes necessary to break up the nuclear family, either
Yes.
by prohibiting marriage or putting marriage on a time limit, but certainly one of the goals, and this is something that Synanon did, among other cults, where they separated the children from the parents, so that then the children could be indoctrinated separately from the parents, and then perhaps eventually grow up to educate the parents. This is all very Orwellian, very Maoist, very Stalinist, but you were talking about the goals of queer theory and the goals of BLM, and also talking about the connection between not anarchism, but you were talking about the straight line towards pedophilia, and I would love it if you would discuss that.
Okay, yes. I mean, I think one of the most interesting thing I could tell you right now is something you've just said resonate with me. When I first got involved in this mess of a subject, I was very ill and I was taken into hospital because I thought I'd had a stroke, and it turned out I hadn't. I had a blocked vein in my neck, but it's a hell of an operation. It was done by an extraordinary surgeon, and then eventually I was awoken by these two nurses, and I was on high dependency unit for 2 days. Then I came back and got involved in this. And I wrote a book called Cult, right? Mm-hmm. Which I wrote high on morphine in 2 weeks and posted on Amazon.
I hate you for that, by the way. I've been trying to write a book for 50 years and I've never managed.
Don't hate me until you try and read it, right? And my friend said to me, he said, it's bloody unreadable. He said, because I was high as a kite. He said, unless you've heard your voice, you can't read it. He said, you need to understand the tenor of your voice to read the book. So this thing's on Amazon and it was up there and I called it Cult. And this is because I was beginning to put together in my mind what was going on, and everybody will find the same. When you start to get involved in this, you just have to go, hang on a minute, I'm looking for the patterns and I can't find them. But you make a point about where does queer theory go with pedophilia? And this is a very easy connection to make, and it makes sense. In November of 2021, Judith Butler, the high priestess of queer theory, had an interview with a political guy in our country here called Owen Jones, who is this kind of rancorous fellow on the far left. And she stated without any hesitation whatsoever that queer theory was about breaking down the boundaries between adulthood and childhood. Mm-hmm. Quite stated it live on his YouTube. Now, people then go, oh, pedophiles, right? But we have to be careful here in taking too simplistic a view of what she meant. Because although, yes, it may mean that they want to break down the barriers between adult and child in terms of sexually, but that's just one bit. The real game and the real end result is to actually destroy the idea of childhood altogether.
And what does that mean?
It means that they are able then to do with children as they would with adults, which is indoctrinate them with what they like, so that, as you've already said, they can then teach the adults that are their parents, and we are truly in Mao territory.
Right.
So you erase the idea of childhood altogether. And in doing so, you then remove the ownership of the child from the parent and you destroy the nuclear family.
Right.
That's the game, right? So it's not just about that people will exploit that to get access to children. We know that if you set up a priestly class, that's what happens. We know this from history. But what you're seeing here is the idea of the concept of childhood being utterly destroyed. And in doing so, that produces a safeguarding nightmare, because you want to be able to look after children from people that are going to do them harm. Well, if the child doesn't exist as an idea, who are you protecting?
Right. That's right.
You know, and it's only got to be 1 or 2 generations, and they won't even remember us. So you're right about the Maoism connection. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I think it's too easy to jump straight to pedophilia. You've got to understand the whole thing.
Yeah, of course. Yeah? I mean, obviously, yes, but as we see where Look, what is the tagline of the radical trans rights movement? This never happens. I
Yeah, yeah.
cannot tell you how many times I have been told by people who are blind adherents to the more radical elements of the trans movement, this never happens. Women do not get hurt in prison by men. Men
Mm.
do not go into rape crisis centers. Men, well, of course, I mean, when you redefine a woman as anything that we say a woman is, then you say men, men who say they're women are women. So yes, it's all women in those prisons, and it's just women hurting each other. No, it's men hurting women.
That's
However,
right.
now the thing is, though, that you and I both know that every single movement that has involved a sexual liberation of any kind, whether it was gay rights, women's, whatever, or indeed these cults that try to break down the bonds of the nuclear family, you see that there are elements, and I'm not saying that the gay rights movement is this way. I am saying that we all know goddamn well that pedophile organizations have been trying to infiltrate the gay rights movement for decades.
No, they
And
did.
they
I mean, that's what
and
Pi was.
right, and they have been fought there has been a great fight to keep these elements out of the umbrella, out from under the umbrella. But when you had philosophers like Michel Foucault and indeed Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and other luminaries of French intellectuals who signed a letter trying to reduce the age of consent, what do we think that is for?
Oh, that's absolutely what it's for. Now, the thing with Foucault, I think in particular, is once you begin to twig that actually, I think that a lot of his work was an apologia for his
Right.
own sexual proclivities.
Correct.
Once you go back and read his work, it sort of jumps out at you like a rabbit out of a hole. You're like, oh my God, there it is. It's there in plain sight. Hence the obfuscating language, right?
Well,
But we
yes.
also have to we also have to consider, I think, in order to get a sort of wider lens, if you will, that everything that they think everything is constructed by language,
Correct.
right? They think it's all constructed by language, right? In which case they can bring things into being just by talking about them. That's their reason for living. But they can also destroy everything else by changing language. Now, we they're utilizing essentially the idea of a priestly class. Now,
Right.
by that I mean they will pick the poor individual because they've got this immutable characteristic, must be held above others and must be treated in a better way than others. It could be the figure of the trans woman. This idea of a terribly persecuted and all the stuff that comes with it. They have to set up this priestly class that ends up giving them a get out of jail free card, because that's exactly what happens when you have a priestly class. In which case, people who have a problem in terms of wanting to get their hands on children will attempt to occupy the priestly class.
Right.
This always happens.
Correct.
The same as you've said about trying to infiltrate the gay movement to give themselves some kind of respectability, which they do not deserve. So yes, of course it happens, and of course we must be vigilant to it. And the best framework for that is safeguarding, and the UK has one of the best safeguarding frameworks in the world in terms of child protection. So it's very true to say that, but it would be remiss of me to say that that's the biggest problem, because that can be controlled very, very locally by parents and by safeguarding professionals within organizations. That's massively different from 250 kids turning up to some drag show where a queer theorist is going to read them a queer story that completely undermines the idea that the wolf was the bad guy in Red Riding Hood.
Right.
So there can be a much more dangerous ideological predation going on here. Do you see my point?
Yes, I do. I do.
Yeah.
However, let me just point this out. All right, so when I was studying these philosophers in college, I did not know anything about their backgrounds, and all of the philosophies that I was learning were so incredibly abstract that it didn't seem like any of it had any applicability to the real world, and at the time, it didn't. We sort of went on our merry way because obviously this was before the internet and before these ideas could be dispersed widely. and then reinterpreted by kids who didn't know what the fuck they were talking about, and they didn't,
Yes.
and they didn't understand some of the impact of what they were saying. So, for example, when I mean, listen, when I read about John Money's experiments, especially what he did to those twins, or Kinsey, and I'd love for you to talk about that. And what how do people who are adherents of queer theory explain away these grotesque human experiments that were conducted by these individuals who are held, I think, in pretty high regard in many circles? And what do you have to say about that?
Well, the ability to protect one's belief system is innate. Otherwise, we wouldn't have religion. So that strength of
Right.
that strength and that sort of zealous fervor that people who are acolytes of this particular belief system display will argue blue in the face that black is white in order to stop themselves from having to recognize that there's an extremely creaky foundation to this entire edifice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're right to say that in France, when the Frankfurt School, sorry, in France, the work of Foucault was, I mean, they're pop stars. I mean, philosophers in France are like pop stars.
Right.
And I would have to ask the question. I'd like to know how good the original translation was from the start. So I would imagine that it's quite possible that this particular edifice had absolute nonsense sort of lodged into it from the first time it was ever translated. And as you say, people don't understand it, or they will use it for their own ends. And it does become the kind of thing that's almost a retrospective activity, because if you think about years ago before the Gutenberg press, you'd have had a situation whereby the priests would have held the power. Well, the Gutenberg press broke that power.
Mm-hmm.
It broke it. And all of a sudden, they didn't have that power over the people anymore. And over hundreds of years, the people learned to read and understand. And they were able to then say, well, hang on a minute, these guys aren't telling us the truth. But again, you're back to the priestly class. And it doesn't matter what the subject matter is, whether it be about Foucault and queer theory, or whether it be any other theory or idea or philosophy, you will always have the kind of drift that we've seen, the mimetic drift we've seen, where what was the original intention actually becomes something completely the opposite by the time you've taken it 20 or 30 years down the road. But we've seen signs of this coming, this kind of construction of worlds that aren't real. If you've ever seen John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, it's entirely about queer theory. Mm-hmm. The idea that this book, the written word, is going to come to life. And it was out about the same time as you were doing your university degree, I should imagine, around that time. So this warning has been there for a very long time that this is coming. And I think that there's people who have attached themselves to part of it and don't realize, as you've said, the history of exactly what it is that they are taking part in, or that the eventual act is to, you ask your average person, should we do away with the nuclear family? They're not going to say yes. Right? They're going to say no. So this concept that they're sneakily trying to do it, but they started with no debate because they don't want anybody to talk about the reality of the situation. But what's the problem is their ability to make people think that what they're doing is nice and to put it as something that's a good thing is so far removed from the reality of the roots of it that it's very hard for people to make that connection without seeing the pattern. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's what the Warrior Teacher Program does, is it helps people to build their narrative. How did they get from the beginnings to where we are now, and understand it at a much greater degree. But you've also got to remember that human gullibility is universal. Right. That we can fall for, even the cleverest of people will fall. And I will go to Hanlon's razor, which is one of my favorite of the razors, to say that never put down to wickedness that which you can put down to stupidity.
Correct.
And I think that much of this, when it does end, will end with a whimper rather than a bang, as people do a quiet reverse ferret and fuck off in the other direction.
Okay, so tell me this, because you mentioned this in passing, but I do want to sort of drill down on this. So what exactly is wrong with having drag queens read stories to children? What is the problem with that?
Well, first off, as somebody who's dabbled in drag myself, I used to have a character called Fanny Butter.
Stop it.
Right? I'll show you the picture one day. Right? Okay. And we used to raise money for charity, and most drag queens that I know, that's what they do. You know, they spend their time entertaining the gays in the village, and you know, or doing stuff to raise money for charity. It's the fact that they're drag queens is a queer act, right? They're not drag queens, and I've made this distinction. There's a video on my channel about the difference between American drag and British drag, because there's a huge difference, right? What they are doing is not drag. What they are doing is queer performativity. Right? And queer performativity doesn't just involve them dressing up in silly dresses and going and seeing the kids. It involves them dressing up in silly dresses, going and seeing the kids, and practicing queer theory. Hence, the wolf becomes the bad guy, the good guy, and grandma becomes the bad guy. Right? Because she won't accept the wolf. Right? That's pure queer performativity. It's designed to undermine the very systems of understanding that a child might have. Now, you think about how important. If you're a parent, I've said this before, I think you walk the most extraordinary line, and I take my hat off to parents who are able to walk that line and do it well, between scaring the shit out of your child so they don't get themselves hurt, and then telling them it's not as scary as they think it is so that they don't become stunted and not explore. Well, that's a bloody fine line, isn't it? That's as fine a line as you get. So these parents have to do that. What these people want to come in and do is say to the 4 or 5 year old that's hearing the story of Little Red Riding Hood, the 4 or 5 year old should know that there are wolves there. Right. They should know. And then the parent will gradually let them out a little bit more at a time as they understand more about the world. They want to go in and say, no, there's no wolves. The wolves are the ones that are the ones that should be the ones that are seen as the good guys. And grandma's the bad guy because she won't accept the wolf. They're telling children that what their parents are doing to raise them is the antithesis of what they should be doing. Now, the fact they go in and pretend to be drag, you know, queer performativity, they're wearing all these ridiculous outfits is one thing, right? But they could be going in dressed in a suit and we wouldn't know they're doing it. So actually they're doing it in that way. You need to look at what they're reading as well as what they're presenting. Now, alongside that, you've also got these drag queens that are doing the most extraordinary things in front of children. And you think, what the hell are you doing? If you did that in public in a park, you'd be arrested. It's that simple. But yet they're getting away with it because we've made a priestly class. It all comes back to that.
So what exactly, look, when I say I have a problem with BLM, it's a problem of a very practical nature. I do not support any organization that embezzles funds that are supposed to be used for activism and uses them to buy luxury homes for the heads of the organization. I don't support that. But you have a philosophical problem with BLM.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely.
Which is?
That I have a philosophical problem with any organization or any idea that says that the world is the result of power and oppression narratives, when we know clearly from the fact that we're able to do what we're doing right now, that the world is actually made up of competency. It's got nothing to do with power and oppression. What do you think power and oppression gave us? Medicine. Power and oppression gave us digital, you know, hand phones that we can use that are digital. Power and oppression gave us the most extraordinary special effects for film. No, it's competency that's run the world ever since the Enlightenment. It's competency that's got us where we are. So it wouldn't matter if they're Black Lives Matter or Three Little Pigs. If their shtick is that everything comes from power and oppression and you have to examine your power and oppression narratives to keep living, then I've got a problem with them, because I'm not living my life like that, and nobody else should be asked to either. It's deranging. It makes people go mental. Because you're always looking for that. So who's got the power? Where's the racism? Where's the homophobia? It's absolute insanity, and it needs to be stopped. It needs to be stopped because it is damaging to the very fabric of our society, and it pits people against each other, which is, of course, the whole idea of attempting to destroy and bring to an end the Western way of world, which they hate so much. And you think if they hated it so much, they'd leave. Why don't they just leave? Go. There's plenty of other places to be. Go. They never do. You know, and it's over here we get them and they support all this stuff. And I always say, right, what are you supporting? Well, I support Black Lives Matter and I support immigration. You know, they're all about the supporting all the stuff that should be supported. And I'm like, oh, fine, give up your house. Give up your job, give it to somebody else because you're white, you know, and you've got privilege. Give it up and give it to somebody else. Right. You know, then they'll tell us that meritocracy is a problem because it comes from whiteness. Right. Meritocracy is a problem, yeah, because the Egyptians weren't meritocratic when they set about building their civilization, were they? It's insane. You know, it's absolutely bonkers. And it's children in particular, it sends around the bend. Right? Because you've got 4 or 5 year old kids that are together, their skin color doesn't matter until you tell them. That's what it's about. It's about breaking down the Western narrative that runs right from the Enlightenment right to where we are now, and doing so that they can upset what they see as heteronormativity. It's all the same thing. The
Well,
teats.
I'm also the teats. I'm also philosophically opposed. Maybe it's because I'm an atheist. Maybe it's because I was raised as a Jew. But I am philosophically opposed to the concept of original sin. And I do not believe that a person is imprinted with certain characteristics when they are born by virtue of their sex, their skin color, their nationality, their religion,
Mm.
whatever the case may be. And I find that this sort of broad brush criticism, or this broad brush alienation of an entire class of people based on an external characteristic, it seems to me to be crazy, but that really is at the root of critical race theory, I believe.
Well, I think it's at the root of a lot of it. I mean, I always
Right.
say they're the sparrows from Game of Thrones. That's what they are. They're the sparrows. It's that simple, really. And it's the religiosity is something that I'm not surprised by, because we killed God. We said God doesn't matter anymore, right? So now it might not matter to me, and it might not matter to you. It might not matter to either of you. It might not matter to the people that are watching today, but to some people it does matter. And if we're not going to have a central narrative that people can attach themselves to, whether that be a religious one or an atheist one, it better be a damn good one, because if not, what we're seeing is the replacement of the narrative of the Enlightenment by grievance, power, oppression, and people who wish to make your life a misery because they are totalitarian.
Right.
Now, you can't point to them. They'll go, which ones? Because this has been an ongoing project for so long, there are lots of people that are doing this and they don't know they are. People don't even know the difference between equality of opportunity and equity.
Right.
Right? So we'll start there. They don't know the difference. So that's a really important thing. So they're pushing equity. Well, they're pushing equality of outcome. Well, we need to gerrymander this so we can get more black people or more Asian people or whatever it may be, more gay people. You saw this, I think it was Yale, wasn't it, who changed their admission policy and made it harder for Asian people to get in.
I think it
so
was
that they can get
Harvard.
more black people in.
It was Harvard.
Harvard.
There was a lawsuit at Harvard because the Asian students were saying that their applications were being weighted negatively.
That's right.
Because there was such a high percentage of Asians being admitted, and Harvard decided to put the brakes on that. And so Asian students or Asian applicants sued the university, and it kind of opened the door into how these admissions decisions are made at elite universities.
It's insane to imagine that the hallowed halls of academia, which in the UK we support publicly, they're public institutions, and we fund them publicly in many ways, would think that it was a good idea to get rid of meritocracy. And that's insane. Can you imagine picking the next generation of people who are going to build nuclear reactors by whether or not they're black, gay, or trans? It's the most insane idea. And there's that lovely story about the kid in the class with the teacher, and the teacher's testing the kids. And the kids are moaning and groaning like they do, because they said every time we have a test, this lot get high marks and we get low marks, and that, all that nonsense. It's not fair. It should be distributed evenly. And the teacher said, okay, we'll do it then. Said, we'll do it. You take a test this Friday, and then we'll even the scores, and everybody will get the same marks. So they all took the test, and that Friday they all got a B. Right? The following Friday they all got a D, and the Friday after that they all got an ungraded. Because those that were doing well didn't bother because they knew it didn't matter, because they'd have it taken off of them. And those that didn't do anything at all continued to do nothing at all. And eventually the entire class broke down into rancor, hatred, and rage because they were blaming each other for what had happened. Well, that's equity. That's equality of outcome. That's what happens. That classroom is a snapshot of China under Mao, of Pol Pot, right? Of all of the worst of dictatorships we've ever seen. That's what equity does, equality of outcome. It is murderous in intent. We shouldn't be saying, well, let's do this, let's get equality. We should be saying, no, there it is, it taints everything, remove it. Because we should want people who are going to operate on me when I'm ill to be the best in their class because they proved it. Not so that we've got enough of them because everybody feels safe about it. No, We want it. And in order to conquer the world, we need, which we are doing well and continue to do well, and conquer the sheer horror of some of the existence that we have to live in. We have done so by elevating those who are the best and paying them well to serve us for as long as they can. Mm-hmm. Well, if you want to get rid of that, feel free, but it will be a disaster. It will be the end of everything, because we will end up with incompetent people in positions that they should not be occupying, in jobs they should not be doing. Mm-hmm. And at that point, everything will fall to pieces.
Right.
Make sense?
That is correct. But the question then is, I mean, you've seen the way these alleged debates carry on social media, with dogpiling, with ganging up, with reporting, with all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it seems like now it is impossible to sit down and have a reasonable conversation about any of these topics without being rigorously and brutally attacked on all sides by very bad faith individuals making bad faith arguments. So the trans issue is only the most recent example of where we've seen this, where if you come out and you make the statement that you do not believe that intact male predators should be locked up with women, for example, then you are subject to a barrage of abuse. You are called every type of phobe, ist, and whatever. And it is impossible to have a conversation about this, a logical conversation. And you are then turning around and you are gaslighting the women who are in prison. And you're being told, and they're being told, no, but if you complain that there is a man who is locked up in your cell, then we are going to punish you for going against the grain. We saw that grotesque example in the UK, where there was a female-only ward and there was a male patient on that ward, and he raped one of the female patients. And the woman who complained was subject to a year-long campaign of abuse and gaslighting by hospital staff who were insisting to the police that it was impossible that a man had raped this woman because it was an all-female ward. And eventually the hospital had to break down and admit, oh yeah, by the way, now that you mention it, there was a transgender woman on the ward. And then it all came to light, but the victim was subject to the most appalling abuse. And the question then is, well, what the hell are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to combat this delusional worldview?
That's how we do it. Mm-hmm. What we're doing now. Running the Warrior Teacher Program, talking to other people, spreading the message, getting out there. You've got to remember that there are very few people who know about this. Right, it's great for us because we're, we generally sort of involved in it. We want to know what's going on. We keep up to date. We make sure that our knowledge is as recent as it can be. But most people don't know about this, and most people don't give a damn. They don't know, and they don't give a damn, and they can't believe half of it because the stories seem so insane.
Right.
And we have to remember that where we are in this particular scrap, you can go so far that talking to somebody who knows nothing becomes almost impossible. Mm-hmm. Because you've got to break it down. That's the hard bit, is breaking it down, which I found so hard with the program, is breaking down what do we need to see and how do we need to see in order to be able to understand it. But doing this is the answer, and also lawfare, which is what will happen, right? Mm-hmm. So there'll be lots of bouncing about of things that will be going on, but it's changing the public mind in a culture war is done by attrition, bit by bit by bit, where you can possibly make a change, and people will wake up and they will listen to us when we come up with a more positive message than the other ones are spouting. Because at the moment they can be kind and think they are just by saying certain things and get away with it. It's what I think Jordan Peterson called, and I like the term very much, compassionate narcissism. Mm-hmm. And it's a very dangerous force. So people want to sit in their little, they don't want to know, do they really? I'm all right, thanks. It's I'm okay until it crawls up the garden path and it affects them. People generally won't get involved. They generally don't want to know. So we have to look very carefully at who it is that we target when we're doing work, for example, or we're trying to get people to change their minds, because you've got a certain sector that there's no point in talking to at all because they're so ideologically captured that you're just wasting your time. But they're not the ones that are going to be voting, or they're not the ones that are going to be changing minds. You've got to ask yourself, who are the ones that are changing minds and how do we reach them? That's the most important question, which I think is what you're asking me. So at that point, you've got to start doing something. Well, the Warrior Teacher Program is my small attempt at doing something. In other areas, we've got things that have happened within universities where people are collaborating now to form organizations that fight against it. One of my friends has started an organization in the public sector that is now gender critical, and they are now visible gender critical. So the conversation's happening. And I think that's how we do it. It is a gradual pushback. It's a, if you will, it's a long march of our own.
Right, right. Well, listen, I mean, for me, it has been absolutely horrifying to watch the way that the medical establishment has completely dropped the ball. They seem to have forgotten that they took a Hippocratic oath, some of them. And I'm sure that if you ask some of these surgeons who are removing the healthy breast tissue of young girls, they would insist that they were not, in fact, doing harm, that they were helping.
Absolutely.
The problem is, for example, when we see a statistic thrown out like, well, if you do not agree to taking the steps that are necessary to allow a young person to transition, meaning the drugs and the surgery, then that child runs a high risk of suicide. But nobody bothers to question two things. One, where do these statistics come from? Where did we get this idea that there is such a high rate of suicide among kids who don't transition? Because this is a very new phenomenon. A very new
Where are the
phenomenon.
bodies? But it's
And
people.
the other question too is, have there been any studies done of people who do transition and then commit suicide? I mean, we need to look at the other side of it, and we haven't done so because we, I believe, are taking a look at statistics that have been cooked by interest groups. I still cannot find the source of these numbers that we are using in order to justify the massacring, basically, of childhood bodies, you know.
I would say that there's a great site called Stats for Gender. Do you know about this?
No, I don't.
Stats for Gender. Go and have a look. You'll be amazed what they've got there. Plus, I don't know whether your viewers are aware, we are currently having what's called the CAS report compiled in the UK, which is a very in-depth analysis of what's happened within the medical establishment. And they've already come out and said that social transition is a psychotherapeutic act. Don't do it, right? Because it's dangerous. Okay. It's what's called iatrogenic, which means it causes the harm that it says is solving, right? So the edifice is beginning to crumble. And I think many people are watching the UK right now. Certainly I hear from my friends in Australia and Canada, Israel, Sweden, are saying we're watching the UK to see what's going to happen here, because I think the UK have managed to be able to push back against this, ironically, because of socialized medicine.
I was going to ask you if you think that there's a connection between the socialized medicine aspect of some of these countries and the fact that a lot of these ideologies took root so quickly. Maybe it's because a general order can go out in a way that it can't go out in this country, for example.
You ask a very good question, and I would answer with a resounding yes. That's exactly it. If you look at Sweden, Norway, where they were well ahead of the game, and we're sort of coming up behind them. It's that the idea of socialized medicine means that it was accepted quicker, but it's going to be seen for what it is quicker. So I think the CAS report will, I think, provide some comfort for people working on this in the United States and in Australia and Canada and everywhere else, Spain, that will mean that they've got something where they can go, hang on a minute, we need to pause. And at that point, if we get it right, the pause will be global. That's what will do it. So the CAS report is a very important report that's going to be coming out hopefully in the next few months, and will give us a very, very firm overview of what's happened in the NHS. But also, there's a bit of an old boys network thing going on in the UK. All these people that were at university went into plum jobs in the NHS. But there's an irony to this for me, of the fact that it might be a socialist state in itself, which is the NHS, is the undoing of gender ideology. I think is a wonderful conceit. Right. It wasn't. Do you get what I'm saying? In that there's this sort of, as you've called it, cultural Marxism, and bearing in mind that the Brits, we magpie from all sorts of places, so we'll quite happily take an idea from here and an idea from there, is that the idea of socialized medicine came directly from the Marxist tradition of, looking after everyone. And the fact that that might be the very thing that's put a stop to it and undoes it fills me with untold joy.
Right.
There's an irony there. Yeah. So I think, it's very easy to be very dark about this and to think that everything is dreadful. But I think we have to start looking forward and recognize that in every war, whether it be a culture war or not, there are always those who will be genuine victims. And that we have to make sure that when we get through this, that we're able to retain the knowledge we've learned so that we never, ever make a mistake like this again.
Well,
That's the hardest.
you would have to have a heart of stone to listen to the stories that are being told by the detransitioners
You would.
and try to write them off as pawns of the right wing and
Yeah.
that kind of thing when you have kids who have altered their bodies in a way that in many ways is irreversible. And that was the other thing that was so galling is that the puberty blockers were sold as harmless.
Hmm.
The hormone treatment was also sold as something that could be easily reversed if somebody were to
Yeah.
change their mind.
Yeah.
And that is not true. That is not
No,
true. And so
it's
now
not true at all.
parents are rising up and saying, wait a second, we did not give informed consent because we were not given the entire array of possible outcomes. If in fact a child goes on these medication or these drugs for X period of time, the voices will remain altered. They will remain sterile. Many things that could happen as a result of it. And
Osteoporosis, eye problems, spine problems. It just
right,
gets worse the more you look.
exactly,
And
exactly.
suicidality post transition is high. It's high.
And I would
So,
still very much want to know why it is that so many young women on the autism spectrum are claiming that they are actually boys. Why it is that there is so much internalized misogyny among these girls. What is it about their bodies? What is it about being a girl that has repulsed them to such an extent or frightened them to such an extent? And to what extent are parents who do not want a gay child sending their kids to these clinics, or in the case of Susie Green from Mermaids, ex-Mermaids,
yeah.
the woman who took her 16-year-old son to Thailand to castrate him.
Yeah. I mean, the Tavistock Clinic, there was a dark joke that went around the Tavistock, a story told by Dr. Bell, who was there, that if we continue the way we're going, there'll be no gay kids left.
Right.
That's how bad the homophobia was that they were seeing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
gender identity, ideology, and queer theory are profoundly homophobic anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Profoundly homophobic, profoundly misogynist, profoundly anti everything. It's a dreadful thing, and people need to start talking about it. I think half the problem with this is right that we're very good at knowing when the right's gone too far.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't
Yes.
think we're very good at knowing when the left has.
Oh my
And I
God, you
think
are.
that, if a kid turned up in a university with a Nazi hat on,
Mm-hmm.
there would be absolute uproar. But they can turn up with a communist T-shirt on and nobody says anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's so there's something about we're beginning to understand what happens when the left goes wrong.
Well, it's funny that you say that because I've always been criticized by my friends because I'm much more critical of the left than I am of the
Mm,
right. And I always
yeah,
explain that as, well, when the right does something that I disagree with and that I think is excessive or ridiculous, to me, that is a dog bites man story. That's how I
yeah,
expect them to behave. And
absolutely.
I expect to disagree. But when the left goes completely off the rails, that's when I take notice because I consider those people to, at least at one point, to have been my people. And I'm
Yeah,
going to be far more critical of somebody in my own family, in my own circle. And I mean, I don't know how old you are, Barry, but I'm assuming that we're all Generation X here. And I think that a lot of us have found ourselves to be politically homeless because of the extremes on both sides. I know that, for example, when I read my friend Nick Cohen's book, What's Left, I became extremely depressed. And I found that I had a like minded individual who was criticizing the left for things that need to be criticized.
hmm,
And we're seeing it getting even crazier here in the United States, where we see that the political parties have been seized by their extremes. And maybe the Democrats haven't been completely co opted by the squad yet, but it is happening. And a lot of people are being left out of this conversation because they cannot relate to the individuals who are supposed to be leading them. It's
yeah.
Disoriented.
Yes, that's the word I was going to use. It's disorientated. Yeah, but you got, take heart, folks. Right, the left didn't leave you. You didn't leave the left. They left you.
Exactly.
Right, they left you. Right, they're now down. They're now down the other end of the bathroom. Sitting on the dildo of absolute mad leftism. Right, it wasn't you. It was them. Right,
Right.
You've not shifted much at all, I imagine. So it's not you. It's them that's left. And I think it's the concept is such that we don't understand the left to the degree that we think that we do. And I think also that our communication and media over the past 50 or 60 years has been driven by the left and the liberals. So actually you haven't heard much other than from the left. And it's amazing when you start to look at the number of lies they've told in order to keep the story going. And now that some of them are showing their true colors, but it's not everybody. And I think we have to take heart from the fact that we've often gone to extremes and seen extremes happen, but we are very, very good at turning around and going, the water's just a bit too cold for me to get in today. So that's what I'm hoping for. And that's very British of me to think that way, because the Brits are like that. They go up to the edge and go, no, I don't think so, and turn around and go back the other way, because our politics is so pendulum driven.
Right.
And the same thing may well happen in the United States if you can keep your right in control, because we don't have the problem with the right that you do.
That's true. You don't.
We haven't got that because we dealt with them rather harshly.
Right.
So they tend. I mean, last time we had somebody rise up from the right, they stuck him on a program called Question Time, and he made a complete arse of himself in front of the entire country.
Who was that?
Nick Griffin, I think his name was.
Well, that's very hard right, though. That's
Yeah.
very hard right.
I mean, they just took him. They just took him to pieces. He fell apart on television.
And
Because-
that's the thing. I mean, I listened to you guys. I mean, you were talking about how you don't have the issue with like racial identity politics that we do. And it was funny because after Rishi Sunak was elevated to prime minister, I posted on Facebook and I asked my British friends, why is it? I mean, if somebody like Rishi Sunak had been elected president of the United States, all the groups that supported him would be throwing their backs out, patting themselves on the back and dislocating their shoulders, saying, isn't it amazing? Look, we've elevated this man of color. And in Britain, nobody gave a shit. It was amazing. I mean, the Indian community was very excited for obvious reasons, but there was never a big issue made about the fact that he was your first Indian prime minister. And one would think, well, in the US, we love to, boast about the firsts and that what that says about us as a country. In Britain, it was like, yeah, okay, he's Indian. We're going to abuse him the way we abuse every other politician, but we're not going to make any kind of a fuss over the fact that he's a man with brown skin. And I found that to be amazing. Nothing could have highlighted the differences between our two countries more than that event, I think.
I mean, I sort of end up having to say in that old trope about the English being fair. That there's a sort of, well, is he the best man for the job? Good. Right, let's see what he does then. We'll give him a chance. Give him a chance. Because we like to see people succeed and do well. And then we like to tear them down. That's how we work, right?
Exactly, yes.
Right? There's no bad thing in that. Whereas the Americans are much more forgiving, I think. The president will do something awful and then Americans go, oh, it's all right. It's just him. There seems to be a difference. I don't know what it is. I really don't know what it is. I honestly don't.
I have to say that as far as the left is concerned, I think there's a huge difference between somebody like Christopher Hitchens going to Cuba to pick coffee, to show his adherence to the cause of the left and Castro and all that kind of stuff, and people taking kids to a clinic to get mutilated. I think that we've sort of gone off the rails when we're talking about the difference between those two mentalities.
And it's also you've got to remember that we've got a size issue as well. I mean, America's enormous. Absolutely enormous, and you've got a huge number of people there. It's if we're turning around a tanker, what the hell are you turning around?
Right.
Because but the other thing being, of course, once you begin the turn can often be more at more speed, perhaps, as people gradually get the message. The end will be faster. So Brits are terribly set in their ways. It's don't frighten the horses.
Right.
So it's that's what we tend to be like, and what we don't like is extremism. We never have. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this fares as it enters the marketplace of ideas and involves more people, because more people are gradually becoming aware. But it's going to be a slow process. It's culture. It's going to be a wave. You know, I'm going to see in about half an hour. I'm going to see Calvin Robinson speak this evening. Who's a guy? Have you come across Calvin?
No.
Well, he's a guy. He's a priest who works in Britain, and he's on GB News. He's a fascinating man, and he's got no time for any of this nonsense. And I'm going to see him speak this evening, so I'm looking forward to that. And I should be leaving shortly. It's just that I'm waiting to see him trounce everything that I trounce everything I hate, which is what he does. Now, you know, we're gradually trying to get people to meet without getting cancelled, so we don't tell anybody where we are or where we're going.
Right.
It's the strangest situation. I feel like I'm part of the French resistance.
Well, that's exactly one of the things that I wanted to bring up with you, which is, you know, around these parts, if, for example, you express concerns about children and indoctrination and that kind of thing, or you talk about, you know, children being operated on, children being given drugs, and so on, you are told that either you're a hysteric or you're a bigot, or that maybe there's something suspicious about you and maybe we need to take a look at your hard drives, because obviously your preoccupation with the safety of children means that you must be up to no good behind the scenes. Similarly,
Pure queer theory.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Pure
Right,
queer
that's it. They'll
theory.
queer anything, these buggers. Right?
Right.
That's what they do. Right, so here's what you have to do. Do you remember the Magnificent Seven?
Yes.
Dun, 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 dun. And then they'd meet up with one that was going to help them and they'd go. And then it was, and on they, right? That's how you do it. Right? Just do it quietly, under the radar, until there's enough of you to make a noise. Yeah?
Right.
And then you're sending letters to the right place, or you're bothering the right people, and gradually you'll go, I've got somebody else who I think might be interested. And suddenly you've got 5 people instead of 2. The next thing you know, you've got 10 instead of 5. This, you know, the war's over. We've got to be the resistance.
The resistance, exactly. Well,
That's it, we're the resistance.
what about if, for example, you say, look, I think that critical race theory promotes a totalitarian movement, of chauvinism based on race, and so on, and then you get dogpiled and you get called a racist. Then what do you do?
I would show them Ibrahim X. Kendi's statement where he says that's exactly what he's going to do. Right? At which point they'd say, I don't believe it, even though it's in front of me, blah, 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 no truth, no truth, no truth. You know, then you wait until, I think Jordan Peterson put this very well. He said, you said it'll happen, you'll get picked on, you wait, and in a week's time it'll go away. That's it, right? It's just, it becomes yesterday, you know, tomorrow's chip paper, digital chip paper, you know? So that's what you have to do, right? But it takes stern stuff to do that. But once you get the resolve and you understand what's going on, it seems like a small price to pay to save children. That's how I look at it.
Right. Right. Well, it's scary. I mean, it's frightening that a lot of these, like, okay, when you mentioned George Floyd, so what is wrong with people protesting an incident like what happened to George Floyd?
Nothing. What is wrong is when an organization like BLM capitalize on it and make money from it so that they can undermine the nuclear family and bring in a world that is seen through a queer and trans lens.
And
that's what's wrong.
How does BLM try to undermine the nuclear family?
Well, it's in their original articles. They actually say a queer and trans lens where the child will be raised by the village.
Right.
That's in their original. I've got it all. I've got the original websites downloaded. You know, well, so that I can make. Go on, sorry.
That original list of demands was hilarious to me because I felt like I was reading a document that had been written by Angela Davis. I mean, it was such a throwback to the 1960s.
It was. It was like it reminded me of. Do you remember the film Network?
Of course.
Do you remember
Lorraine
when Fonda hooked up? I've had enough of this, and I'm not going to put up with it anymore.
That's right. That's right.
You know, it's the same thing. It's the same. You know, what you've got here essentially is an idea that was cooked up by a bunch of disgruntled Trotskyists in the 60s that's now come to fruition. Right? Right? And once you put it, you know, somebody will say something to me now. I go, oh, shut up, you disgruntled Trotskyist, and they go, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you're just talking about stuff from the 1960s. It's 2022. Get with the program." So once you get the narrative and you feel powerful about your narrative, i.e., you feel you can, if taken on, you can give a narrative that matters and makes a difference, which is what the warrior teachers are doing. You can dismiss people. What are you talking about? You absolute unmitigated 1960s Trotskyist. Shut the hell up. You can have a go then, and they go, "What do you mean? Do you really want me to spell out where you're wrong, really, in front of people?" So, everybody finds their own way, and we make mistakes along the way, and we just have to learn to get better at it. In a world that's steeped in information, most of it's bullshit. We all become teachers and we all become students. Become a warrior teacher. That's the way forward.
Well, before you go, I really do want you to touch on the way that including T with LGB, what that has done to the gay community.
Yes, certainly. You've got to remember that the T has been part of the community for a very long time, right? But the T stood for transsexual, not transgender, right? Homosexual transsexuals have existed for a long time. And the reasons why they would have done what they would have done, and not many did it, are complex and deeply rooted in misogyny and homophobia. They're very deeply rooted in the history of the UK gay movement. But the T was they were very feminine gay men who couldn't cope with life as men. So that they would take on the garb of femininity and a kind of, but they knew what they were, mind. They never thought they were women.
Right.
These were, they might have been feminine, but they were strong as dirt. I've seen them take down people that were misbehaving in the village with their handbag. Smack and down, it's like, don't mess with him. That's the transvestites, and then of course the transsexuals. Then you have the transvestites who turn up just because they get off on putting on a pair of knickers and a dress, right? And so they were usually straight men. Then you've got other people who are cross dressers because they like to get banged in the bedroom with a pair of high heels and fishnets on. There are all these different sort of dissolute groups, and then along comes transgender, which is meant to be an umbrella term, and suddenly you can include anybody you like under it, and you've got a bloke with his fetish out in your workplace.
Right.
That's how it happened. And the effect is not just on the gay community, it's going to affect everybody. In terms of the gay community, it's allowed people LARPing as queer and trans to enter gay spaces and take over and bring critical race theory with them. Because at the last Pride in Manchester, they did an entire 30 minutes about all that crap at a vigil for gay men who died of AIDS.
Oh, you mentioned that. That.
Yes. It's like, okay, now you pushed it too far. I'm doing a report on Manchester Pride, which is proven it's on the back burner right now because I've got other stuff going on. But I've started collating and putting it together. And as soon as I've got it together, it's going to the Charities Commission and the police. Because I think that it's what we call a prevent issue. Prevent is about terrorism. It's about extremism. And I think that Manchester Pride is run by extremists. So that's where I'm at. So from that perspective, it's caused a fracture, but not too much. And the idea of the gay community is a silly idea. It doesn't really exist. It's a gay constituency, because there's a lot of people that will go out and be hedonistic, and I did it for bloody years. Off your face, staggering home with a box of crunchy fried southern chicken in your hand. Trying to get the key in the door, and then waking up in the morning having not eaten the chicken, but lying on it in your bed with the gravy all over your chin. I've lived that life. I was a hardcore. Right, so all you ever hear about is the hedonists. You never hear about the average gay bloke who's just living around the corner doing his job and living his life, because being hedonistic and being sexual is not everything that exists for him. Right. So there is no gay community. There is only a gay constituency. The LGBTQI2 plus S hands, knees, and bums and daisy people are a different thing altogether. They're an ideological cultist group. It's hard, isn't it? All this.
It's very, very hard, and it's really a huge drag because the challenge seems to be insurmountable, and you have to be able to express your views opposing certain activities or certain things without coming off looking like a giant bigot. I mean, they're going to call you a bigot anyway. But you have to make people understand it's not about bigotry. It's about reality. It's about, it's about the fact that lesbians would very much like to have, let's say, a dating site where men do not infiltrate and try to have sex with them, which is an age-old heterosexual male fantasy.
Oh, isn't it ever?
So you know, the fact that you have a fetish, a sexual fetish, should not then become the problem of the lesbian community.
Well,
Similarly, gay men should be able to go to a sauna or a bar without having women walking around calling them faggots or bragging that they're walking around naked about around a bunch of naked men
I
and
call I
trying to
call
be,
them fag hags on steroids.
very nice.
Like, well, what do you say to what are they doing there? They're going to get hurt at some point.
Right.
You know, they're women, right? And they're going to go in with some guy one night, and it's going to be the wrong night, and the guy's going to have had something or taken something, or he's going to be drunk as a skunk, and they're going to do what they do in disrobe, and it's going to be smack, right? Sex by deception. It's a crime in this country. It's a crime.
Is it still though? It seems like now
No, it
people
still
like
is.
Nancy Kelly are openly advocating for sex by deception.
Oh yeah, they want it gone. They want that law gone.
Right.
They want it gone. Not on my watch. That's me with delusions of grandeur there for a second.
No, but it's
I wouldn't
true.
have it. It's true. Yeah.
It's true.
It is true. And at that point, I'm going to have to leave you. I've got to go and see
Oh.
Colvin. I'm very excited to see Colvin.
Thank you, Barry. Thank
But
you
this has
so
been
much.
fabulous.
It has been, hasn't it?
We didn't hear from Mr. NEGZ much, did we?
There's Negs.
I apologize. I told Clara prior to the broadcast that I was going to be doing a lot of listening and learning. I have a lot to say, but I don't think an hour would be long enough.
No, this is unfortunately how it works.
Yeah, right. I appreciate you coming on. It was very informative, and I have to say that everything you said, I may not have thought it in those exact words, but I agree.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure to come and speak to you, and I hope all your viewers have enjoyed it. And please do take a look at my Warrior Teacher program. Come and join us.
Thank
Team's
you, Barry.
growing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so
It's
much.
fantastic to see you, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
We will.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day, all of you.
Thank you, my love.
All right,
See you
have
later.
a good day, man. All right. Well, I spent the time listening because you two were volleying off one another quite well, and the only thing I really had to offer were clips of humor. It probably wasn't the best stuff. Or maybe it was. Who knows?
That's okay, though. I mean, the thing is, the whole point of having Barry on was to explain where these mindsets come from. And if we are going to oppose something, we need to know what we are opposing. We need to understand the thinking of people who disagree with the way that we think, and we need to be able to respond in a way that kind of takes into account their mindset. I know that's extremely difficult, but when
Right.
you start to realize that a lot of what these people are advocating for, and how it is a victimhood movement. These are movements based on status assigned by victimhood. Then you realize, holy shit, this is a big task that we have ahead of us, and
Absolutely.
we can't allow ourselves to be railroaded by people who try to use victimhood status in order to gain, if you want to call it superiority, you can. I mean, that's a word, but it's it's not. These are not meritocratic movements. These are not movements where we gain an advantage based on the fact that we're smarter, the fact that we're more accomplished, the fact that we have all these characteristics, but based on things that we cannot control. We cannot control our skin color. We cannot control our sex. We can't control things of that nature. And there is a kind of inherent unfairness in saying, well, just because you were born with X skin color or X eye color or whatever, then that means that you are by definition inferior and you need to be under my boot. That is absurd.
Yeah, like racism and bigotry. That's exactly what I've been saying for 2 years. Every time I had an opinion on somebody who happened to identify as some group that considered themselves marginalized,
Right.
was that I was a bigot. And I'm like, so you're telling me that I can't have a voice or an opinion because of my skin color and who I am? That's wild to me, because, and I will always go back to Jim Crow. Like, stop giving me my own water fountain. I'm allowed to be a part of the conversation too. And I will even also go as far as to label this type of movement as woke supremacy, and because there's a lot of frauds latching themselves onto it to grasp power, like Justin Trudeau, for example.
Right.
It's been hard in the United States because of it being 50 states, but in Canada it's a little easier for him. So it is. It's
Hmm.
absolutely supremacy embedded in bigotry.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I told Negs this story. I might as well share it with you guys too. And that is that the first year that I was at Brown, the big political push on campuses across the country was divestiture from South Africa. It was an anti-apartheid movement. And I went down to the mailroom to pick up my mail, and there was a girl who was standing there with a petition that she wanted me to sign to get the university to divest. And I mean, I was happy to sign it, but I just casually and innocently asked her, well, let me ask you this. If the university divests from South Africa, how will that impact apartheid? And she became absolutely irate with me and started calling me a racist. And I said to her, wait a second. In order to understand how hilarious this incident was, you would have to know what this girl looked like. She was blonde haired and blue eyed, in
Hmm.
the full preppy garb with the Izod sweater, and so on. And I said, wait a minute, but I just asked you an innocent question. I mean, you're asking people to sign a petition, but you can't explain your position without hurling an insult at me, and I don't appreciate that. I would like it if you would respond in some logical way. And she just dogpiled me and started hurling even more insults at me. And I asked her, I said, it strikes me that you probably went to a school like Dalton or Choate or Phillips Exeter, where I'm guessing that you probably didn't interact that much with people of color. You probably don't know a goddamn thing about South Africa or about the political structure of that country. But you have the gall to look at me in the eye and tell me that I'm the problem when you're the one who is pushing for a political position that you clearly do not understand. So that was my first taste, and that was in 1982. Now, obviously, who would know that that mindset would then get so popular? And this is exactly what people do when they cannot come back at you with a reasoned and rational argument based on facts. They hurl insults. So I guess that the best thing that you can do is just let it go in one ear and out the other.
That's true.
And it was pretty funny because, I graduated from a DC public high school, and
Right.
here's this private school girl who is telling me about myself, and I was like, "Oh, bitch, not today." No, I don't think so. But now it's a more widespread attitude, and it's infuriating. But all you can do is just come back with logical, rational arguments that are fact based. Let's get
Mhm.
back to facts.
Yeah. If that fails, just throw up a bird.
That too.
Yeah. Like go fuck you. A good old go fuck yourself is a good a good exclamation point on a endless argument.
Hmm. All right, you guys, I want to thank you guys so much. Next week, we are going to have Monty on because we are going to be taking a wider view of the anatomy of an internet smear. And that is where I am going to take a back seat and I am going to let Negs and Monty talk because Negs and Monty have both been victims of internet smears, and we saw it come up yet again recently in the case of Negs. And so we're going to take a look at how internet smears come about and what they can do to the target. So I hope you guys will join us for that. It's going to be a great conversation, and then we're going to be having more guests throughout the month of December. So I want to thank you guys for being here and for supporting the podcast.
Thank you,
And
Becky.
until next week, thank you.
We'll see you then. TheAddictPodcast.com. We'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.